Thanks for tuning in to My Valley, His Victory, hosted by me, Mackenzie Smith, where I interview Christians who love the outdoors and have walked through valleys in their lives. In a world of highlight reels and surface-level relationships, we all have faced hardships. I believe our experiences can be encouraging to others if we have the courage to be vulnerable. 2 Corinthians 1 says, "The Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." My goal is to inspire you to come to the Creator through His creation and connect you with Christians who have been through similar experiences. I pray that this podcast encourages you if you are in a valley and pushes you to share how God has turned your past valley into His victory. If you enjoy these episodes, please take a moment to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform and follow this podcast on Instagram. If these episodes have been impactful for you, or you know someone that would benefit from one of these episodes, please feel free to share it with a friend. Your support means the world to me. Thanks so much for being here. On today's episode of My Valley, His Victory, we have Bryce Campbell. Born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, Bryce has 3 siblings, 2 older sisters and a younger brother who passed away. He grew up on the water and in the outdoors so much that his mother began homeschooling the 4 kids after a principal objected to skipping school to spend time at the beach and local parks. He felt an immense pressure to go to college, but objected to, and instead went into carpentry as a joiner. High-end customer furniture, basically. I'm glad you clarified that because I didn't know what that meant. The last 4 years, he's been traveling the states and world and sharing his story and adventures on social media and his email newsletter. Having found God in creation, he finds a deep purpose to inspire others to venture out there where they can meet him as well. Thanks so much for being with us today, Bryce.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always say bios are, what you want people to know about you, but why don't you share just a little bit more about who you are, where you come from, and just a little part of your story?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Bryce. Obviously, I have an Instagram account, a TikTok. I run on social media, have a presence there, and an email newsletter. And it all started a few years ago. Grew up, didn't go to college. Homeschooling played a big part in that. And didn't really know what I wanted to do in life. So I took a little bit of a risk. There's a backstory there we'll get into, of course, but took a trip to the Alps by myself alone, no plans, no anticipations at 17, which is pretty out there. I wouldn't even do that today, I don't think. But all that led to falling in love with photography, and eventually that led to writing and led to where I am now with Bryce Travels and preaching a little bit the word on social media.
Yeah. So what took it to social media? Because that's obviously where you are now. So when did that start, and what prompted you to kind of make a personal brand out of this?
Yeah, it's a little bit funny. My dad comes into it, but originally I was just posting photos of my truck and where I would travel around the States. I didn't have a big social circle because I was homeschooled. I think, truthfully, I was seeking a little bit of attention or validation from sharing stuff online with the people that I did know in the community. I worked at a surf shop, so there were people there who kind of rolled in the same circles of traveling and experiencing the world. But I did it first for attention, I would say, and relationships and reaching out and getting to know people subconsciously. And that was just photos of my trucks and my travels, photos from the Alps and where I'd been. And the whole writing portion of it started really with just naming photos. I mean, now I would say I would be known most for my writing and my captions and my newsletters, but I originally just started coming up with names for my photos, 1 or 2 words at a time. And then that over the past 3 or 4 years has transpired into, I have a book out, I guess. I kind of forget about that sometimes, but I even have a book. So now I just write, but that's how it originally began.
Yeah. And is writing something that you have always enjoyed, something you've kind of always had a knack for, or how did that come into play?
No, growing up, I kept to myself a lot. I was very on my own by choice. I didn't really get along with people my age. I didn't really feel a connection there. I had friends, but it never went deeper. As I got into my teenage years, it was just those friends that come and go that you have by circumstance. So what originally began it was I didn't have those relationships where you could verbally communicate with people. So I would just journal. I mean, I remember the first time I had a legal pad I stole from my dad's office, and I just didn't know how to verbally express what I was feeling. So all I knew to do was to just write it down and get it out of my head. And that's how that started.
Yeah. And it seems to be a gift that you have because you're really good at it.
I would definitely say it's a blessing that I've been given, for sure. I obviously didn't know I have it, but I would definitely say it's something that's been provided by the Lord, and hopefully I use it to his glory. I think everybody has these gifts, and you kind of get to choose which way you're going to use them,
For sure. For sure. So went to the Alps, came back. College was in the windshield of, what you thought you were going to do or what everybody wanted you to do. Kind of talk to us about making that decision to not go, and kind of just some of the experiences maybe that you've had since then that you've been able to have since not going.
For sure. As expected, when you're 16, 17, you're supposed to go look at college, and you kind of have that in your mind. Even if you don't know what you're going for, you go for business or something useless. I was working full-time at the time at Chick-fil-A, managing the kitchen. And I was saving up money. This is the time when I took a gap year to go to the Alps in between college, because my sisters were I have two older sisters. They were kind of like, hey, if you don't know, don't leap into it, which was very good advice looking back. And so I didn't. I worked full time, saved up money, and just drove around South Carolina, putting gas in the truck and seeing what I could. I remember after that, going into summer, my dad and I went up to Clemson, which is one of the two big schools in the state, and toured it and spoke with one of the administrators. The only thing I could really think of doing was going for forestry, because I liked being in nature. A little bit ironic because in South Carolina, that's just cutting down trees. But I came out of that meeting completely overwhelmed. I remember sitting at a Zaxby's in Clemson. We were getting lunch, my dad and I broke down crying. I didn't understand any of it. It was the most overwhelming and out of place I've ever felt. Looking back, I can definitely say that's a positive event, but in the moment that was mission critical. I was not doing great. And coming out of that, I knew immediately college is not on the table. I don't know what I'm going to do instead, but there's no way I can sit through 4 years. I couldn't even get through a meeting with an advisor. So after that, I went back home, went to work, and started working at one of the local surf shops, which was crucial. Everybody has a stereotype. I mean, look at my hair, of people who work in a surf shop, and they're all accurate. But one of those is people, they are very accurate. They are. I was probably the only one there who didn't really drink or smoke weed. But everybody there was traveling the world in their different ways. The owner, he raced in Dakar, which is a race across the Middle East. He did that 4 times. He raced across Africa. He did that 4 times on motorcycles. So that's kind of the spirit that was around me. People would come into the shop and they'd be just back in town visiting, but now they lived in Costa Rica or the Dominican Republic. For me, being from Charleston, having only really done one trip, which I was forced into by circumstances mostly, that was refreshing. And that ultimately led me to deciding to take a big road trip across the country, which I didn't plan out at all. I just spent $3,000 putting a rooftop tent on my truck. And I saved up a few grand living at home, obviously 18 years old, and hit the road. There was, again, no planning. I just decided I've got to go see what's up. And I wouldn't even say it was by choice. It was more so running away from whatever turbulence I was feeling in my life at the time.
Yeah. So kind of talk to us a little bit more about that experience and maybe some of the places you traveled and like what what at this point and at that point outdoor recreation like looks like. You said you got a rooftop tent, you went camping. Like, how did you experience the country, and how do you kind of form experiences now? What's your means of travel?
Yeah. In that time, again, I was running away from my own life. There were circumstances, a bad relationship, which everybody has when they're 17, of course. And that was really the driving force in getting out of town. So semi GPS out west, no plan, $4,000. Again, this is something, looking back, I cannot believe I did this. I mean, it had to be divine, because there's no way I had the mental capacity or the willpower. But I just drove around for 2 or 3 months. On this trip was a very pivotal event. I remember I was in Montana and I got a call from my mom. I was on the side of the interstate, actually just on the Idaho border of Montana, and the only place that had cell service. I hadn't had signal for 3 days when I was camping. And my mother called me to tell me that my brother had taken his own life and that I needed to get home. And so that's what I did. I drove to Spokane, which was back west, a few hours, and flew back home for a few weeks. And this is really the true origin story of what I do now, which is, how do you recover from an event like that? How do you find God? For me, before that, I was, a young Christian, whatever that means. You believe in God, but you don't really have a relationship. I didn't at the time, certainly. I came back, got in my truck, and I was in Idaho, and I just spent the next month in the woods, driving around, working my way back home slowly, South Dakota, Kentucky, all the places in between there. And in that time was absolutely pivotal, not even conversation, but just teaching. I was really being taught by God through creation, what beauty was, what purpose was, these different things. And I would say that's when I really developed a personal relationship and understanding of God. I came back home, and I remember one time I would do these little trips out to Tennessee or whatever, 4 or 5 hours away, and go spend the night when I wasn't working. And I remember one time I was camping in the woods in Tennessee, put my solar panels out so I could charge my phone. And I remember just praying to God for direction or community or anything. And in that moment, this is something that's been a recurring theme, is I just felt the overwhelming command to just step into somewhere new. And at that time, it was to step into church and find community. And that was the first time I'd been. We went growing up, but as you're a teenager, you don't go to church really. And from there, it's just transpired. Nowadays, I went to Alaska through Bryce Travels and the community I've found online and built with some people I didn't even know at the time. I just knew one of them through Instagram, and he said, "Hey, I need a 4th person to go backpacking in Denali National Park." And I said, okay, hopped on the phone for 15 minutes and booked a ticket for 3 days from then. Other adventures, I lived in New Zealand for a few months earlier this year. And that was a similar experience where I never felt, pressure or weight, like, oh, am I going to do this or not? It was really, I don't know if I should use the word a divine calling, but definitely a pull to go. Nowadays, the rooftop tent, is in storage. That's gone. I have a truck camper that I'm remodeling, which has taken a year and probably another year if it doesn't go to plan. And just road trip around the country with that and see, share my adventures with people in my travels. And really my purpose nowadays with Bryce Travels is to inspire people to get into the outdoors, to get outside into creation so that they can, find God. It's very difficult to find God when you have so much noise coming into your life, and urban environments don't help that much. So for me, I know, getting out of town and spending one night even under the stars is absolutely crucial for communicating, or more so listening and hearing from God.
Yeah. Totally agree. And thank you for sharing that story and kind of just those pieces of the puzzle. For you, maybe now, or you can even go back to, that time where you said you didn't really have a relationship with God, and that's kind of where you started to find God. But how did creation, and maybe even today, how does creation play a role in your relationship with Christ?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. There's a famous quote in one of C.S. Lewis's books where he basically, this is offhand, but says, you really don't want to use creation as an argument for the existence of God with an atheist. It's not that convincing. But as a believer, deepening my relationship with God, I've written about it before. There was this one day I was in the upstate of South Carolina along a river just after I was concussed last year. I was supposed to be at home for like 2 months in bed, but I went camping instead about a week after. My doctor was not stoked, but I remember sitting in a stream. It was 90 degrees, just trying to stay cool, which is crucial. And a dragonfly came and just landed on my knee. And looking at that, already as a believer, it's something where you see the colors, you see the scales, and you see the design, and you go, there's obviously something more here. There is a creator who cares about this dragonfly, so obviously he's caring for me in my life. And that extends to any adventure that I've ever taken.
Yeah. It's funny, we're going through a book at church right now that the last chapter, it was like 20 things. I think the title of the book is like 20 things every believer should know. And the chapter we just went over was creation. And we had a long conversation in our Bible study about what other people believe and how, the earth came to be. And, part of my story is I was atheist agnostic for about 12 years. And one of my biggest things that I couldn't get over was the science piece, because you're just taught to trust science all growing up. And, 2 + 2 is 4 because math says so. And, and so science, I'm just a very, I need evidence, I need proof, I need, things to come together. And so anyways, that was one of my biggest hurdles in coming to Christianity, was getting over that and seeing how the Bible and science come together and how they actually work to support each other. And so,
yeah, I mean, creation is, again, if you're trying to convince a non-believer of the Lord, obviously creation is not, that's probably the most. You really have to have an encounter with God. If you just go, oh, the grass looks really pretty when it's green, they just get, oh, that's evolution or something. Yeah. You're supposed to like green grass. It's like, okay. But if you're a believer, there's no, and of course science supports God, and the guy who came up with the Big Bang Theory is a Catholic priest, 120 years ago. So science fundamentally is a creation of, especially the Roman Catholic Church, which I'm not a part of, but it is, science fundamentally is Christian at its essence. Yep. Of course, that's not very convincing if you don't believe, but if you do believe, all science does is just explain the beauty that you're already seeing. It explains, how that dragonfly has 5 different shades of blue on one little scale and why it's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen.
Yeah. I always, when I'm out in nature, I'm always just like, man, God is one of the coolest artists that ever existed, because the amount of detail and things. And I think, science and in the Bible, there's a correlation, because there's always supposed to be this great mystery. The Bible's very clear that we're not supposed to understand it all. And I think, that's where people in science are like, no, we have to figure it out. It's no, this was designed, there's a reason we can't understand why certain parts of the brain do certain things, and, why X, Y, and Z. We could list a million things we don't understand as humans, but.
I mean, of course, the first greatest sin, what was it? Trying to know everything. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot to be said for finding comfort in not knowing, which is something that personally has taken me, years to come to peace with. But once you arrive there, I think that gives your faith even more weight, even more credibility.
Yeah, for sure. And I think just the level of being able to look at something and understand its beauty without having to understand it is a totally different posture as well, of just I can really appreciate, I don't know what it is. I don't know why it exists. I don't know, whatever. but I can appreciate it. And I think like for me, that's what you're saying, that is a place I had to step into a lot in the Bible, is like, there's parts that I don't understand, but I can appreciate that it's part of the bigger story. And, I don't fully understand why God did this, but I just have to trust that it's, that it fits and that he's doing all things for good, even though it may not always look good. There's a level of that in all aspects of it for me, I think, at this point. So can you share a story with us about a time in which maybe God has revealed himself to you in the outdoors, a moment or a story that you had specifically?
Yeah, there's so many, especially just in the day-to-day spending time in the outdoors, that just builds up over time. But I kind of touched on it earlier, that one pivotal moment in Tennessee. I was up in the mountains and I was doing something called the Georgia Traverse, even, which is dirt roads all the way across northern Georgia. But I ended up in the mountains of Tennessee somehow. That's how these trips always go. And this is the most profound, or it's one of the original, like, I can look back on and go, this was absolutely divine. I've had events like this before. Some people, God speaks literally to them in words. Some people, they have a dream of, water coming over a mountain, and that means something to them. To me, I don't have either of those. I get these deep, they're not gut feelings. They're so far beyond that. And this was the second time it's probably happened in my life, was in the mountains in Tennessee camping. Just got off the phone with my dad, I believe, drove up, found a nice spot. And I was just, it wasn't even, prayer, like conscious prayer. I was just like rambling to God if he was listening, if anybody was listening to me. And there was no thought to it. I just needed to get these things off my chest that I was going through. And one of the big ones was having no friends or no community, which is something I had struggled with. I really felt like nobody I was around. I was homeschooled from the second grade through high school, but after that, nobody at any of the jobs I worked did I relate to, older or younger or my age. And in this moment, I was just praying to God for community, or really just yelling at God to give me community more accurately. And what I got was not something I can really comprehend. It was more so just the unreal willpower to actually walk into a church on my own, which is something I would never do. And looking back, I can say this about that first trip to the Alps. I mean, I've already said it. That's not something I would do. Go to Europe alone. Like, to Geneva? That's insane. I wouldn't do that today. But looking back, there's those few moments, 4 or 5 of them in my life, where I can definitively say what's occurred is supernatural willpower to do things that are beyond me. And of course, that's a very biblical gift or intervention of the Holy Spirit that I feel very blessed to be able to recognize nowadays.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, share a little bit about, you said you got the overwhelming willpower to go walk into a church. Like, share a little bit about that experience. And was it a positive? Was it a negative? Was it a middle of the road? Like, I would assume, and I'm going on a limb here, but if you felt like it was, this overwhelming desire, willpower from the Holy Spirit, that there was a blessing tucked in that in some way for you.
Well, that is a limb that you went out on that you should have gone out on, because that's exactly the case. I feel like church is something that church didn't have a bad connotation for me growing up. I went to a great church when I was younger. It's just not something that was really in the cards as a teenager. But more so for me was the anxiety of walking into a place like that. And along with I would say the Holy Spirit gave me a few things in that moment, which was first, like the craving to really go. You really have to get to these low points to allow God to intervene. Before that, you're kind of, I'm Bryce and I'm 17 and I can do whatever I want. the craving to go, the willpower to actually do it and seek it out. And of course, the gift that followed, the blessing that was tucked in there. So I remember thinking, well, a church is really just like shopping for a house, which at 18 or 19, I had never done. But I knew what shopping for a house was like. And it's not your job to really impress the house of God. If you're going into a church, it's kind of their job to win you over, their job to come up and make you feel welcome, their job to introduce themselves and show you where to sit, all these things. So that gave me it definitely wasn't confidence, because I was not confident, but it alleviated some of the anxiety that came along with walking into a church. And I found this specific church, one of the managers who I hadn't talked to in years from when I was working at Chick-fil-A. I shot him a text out of the blue probably 2 years after we had last talked, and kind of asked him like, hey man, I knew he went to church, and I asked him, hey man, do you have any recommendations for a church that, that you go to? And he said, well, I go to this, church where we wear black ties on Sundays, and you probably won't want to go there. But I did used to go to this other church where some other people that you worked with go. So I kind of had an in there, a little bit of guidance. But of course, the day I showed up, none of those people were there. So I was walking in on my own, forced to meet new people and really lean out of that social anxiety and into kind of the future that God had for me, which I wasn't even knowingly doing. And in that was a fantastic church that I stayed with for probably 2 years or over 2 years, and built some of the foundational relationships with people I still have in my life today. People I get coffee with once a week and do Bible study with, even though I'm at a different church. Those foundational relationships that are crucial to a life that glorifies God. Of course, you can do it alone, but it's a lot easier if you have community. And I credit all of that, not to myself, but to the Holy Spirit, to God.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think that it's really amazing how you had that desire for community, and God blessed you with that in the right way. And because I think as a young kid, 18, 19, however old you were at the time, like it can be so easy to just fall in with different crowds, and to have a foundational community that is biblical and, that really has your best interest and God's will in mind, is really important, especially in that time of your life when people are normally kind of out trying to figure it out,
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, again, hindsight's 2020. So I can look back at all these terrible events and periods in my life, which if I had to run the odds, objectively, we're probably a good 30 to 40%. I mean, we haven't even touched on it because I kind of skipped it over, because to me, I don't even see it as, pain or a problem, but as a blessing. But my dad got diagnosed with terminal cancer in this period after I went to Switzerland, but before I went on my first road trip. He's alive, of course. He was given 6 months, and now he's over 5 years. And it didn't even come to me to bring it up, because it's just been transformed by God into a blessing, something that he uses to advance his kingdom in different ways.
Yeah.
With my dad, with me and my siblings, and our relationships with God in all these ways. But that first, period of my life from 16 to probably even earlier, from 12 to, 18 without community. Of course, then I was like, why do I not get along with these people? There were people I would go and hang out with, and people who wanted to be friends with me, but there was never, nothing ever clicked there. In that time, that was a struggle, but looking back, that was absolutely a blessing. I was being protected, if you will, from, I don't know if they were inherently bad actors, but from a life that, probably wouldn't have glorified God to the extent that it has now, I think would be safe to say.
Yeah, definitely. And when you went into that church and you began to find this community, what, if you can pinpoint it, what was different and like what made you feel connected to them? Was it because they liked the same things that you liked? Was it because you were the same age? Like, because you're saying that you didn't feel these connections to these people, different people before, and now you were able to connect with people. What was the tie?
The things you said are what you might naturally go to. They were similar in age or similar interests, but we really didn't have much in common besides the fact they went to the church that I walked into. Now, of course, we have similar interests. There's guys I surf with, I met at that original church. But, the main thing was just the welcoming spirit that people had and the honesty. And again, I think crucially, the Holy Spirit, because there's, certain places you go where you are supposed to go. And there's certain places you go where you're not supposed to go. And that was a place where I was supposed to go. And the specifics of how, just like nature, the specifics of how it worked are above my pay grade. I really can't say. I mean, it was just something where it's so not tangible when it's communicated, but it felt right. I knew it was right. And I walked in there and I was like, okay, I'll be back next Sunday. And, 2 years of that.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. No, I think that's cool because the reason of me asking that was we think that our friends are supposed to be people we have things in common with, people we're the same age with. Like, you think that those are the things that you would naturally connect with. And it's like you had that around most of your life and you just didn't feel connected to that.
I think it's absolutely crucial to have friends that you don't, have those things in common with. I have buddies who are having their second kid. They're, a few years older than me, having their second kid, been married for a few years. And other buddies who are just having their first kid. And then I've got buddies who are younger than me, and the friends who are older, their wisdom and some of them are probably not as wise as me, if I'm being honest. I'm not going to name names, but the wisdom generally I get from my buddies who are older is, you can't get that from somebody who's 23 or 24. And the people younger than me, I see it less as a more of a relationship where I can pour into somebody. I view it, transactional is not the word, but if it is a transaction where I'm giving away,
Yeah.
Whereas the guys older than me that, I spend time with, they pour into me. So I think it's crucial to have friendships of all varying types. And of course, some people you're just not going to click with, of course. And you do want to have some stuff in common.
Yeah.
Jesus, for one, would be great, but surfing or, Toyota trucks or whatever it is. But there's people who pour into you, and you should really, everybody yearns for that, but you should really chase after that. And you should also, when God gives you the opportunity, take advantage of the abilities that you've been given to pour into younger people who are looking for those older people.
Yeah. So good. So good. I think that so often we see friendships as like, I do for you, you do for me. It's this like even thing. And it's like, I like what you said, because it's kind of this like stairs. It's like, I have someone that's, helping me in this area of my life, and then I'm able to help down, and it's kind of this trickling effect. And it's not necessarily like you can't provide the same thing to your older friend that, he can provide for you. And there's just different things that different people can provide in different seasons and in different ways. And it doesn't make any of those friendships less beautiful or less important. I think that kind of our cultural view of relationships a lot of times is, like I said, that even like tit for tat kind of mentality. And it's just like, if that's your view of relationships, like you're missing out on so many.
You're not going to have any.
Yeah.
You're not going to have
You're
any.
gonna have
if I
fake
kept
friends.
score, if I kept score of what I did for people and what people did for me, my relationships would be jaded. Not because I do so much for people, but because you don't have a accurate perspective.
For sure.
People think they do stuff for you that you don't even imagine,
Yep.
I think it's really crucial for everything in life, for marriage, which of course I'm not, but for marriage and relationships with your parents and how your church operates to look at the scripture and see how Jesus did it, or how, later on in the New Testament, Paul and the apostles did it. And those friendships, I think, if you, read beyond the word of the Bible into some of the historical accounts and study it more in depth, these are people who really had some of them followed Jesus when he was alive. Some of them came afterwards, but all different backgrounds, Jews and non-Jews, who have nothing in common besides Jesus. And those are some of the most foundational relationships of the church.
Yep. Totally agree. Okay, so for a listener who may not get the opportunity to take a trip to the Alps or road trip across America and do all of these really cool adventures, but maybe live in a little bit more of that urban environment like we talked about before, what are ways that they can connect with God through creation without being in these like super magical places?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I think sometimes, I've encountered this obviously with my social media presence, but you want to be careful not to get an unrealistic expectation. I have been blessed with all these experiences, and truthfully, I feel it is absolutely divine. The skills that I have are divine in nature. My writing, I cannot take credit for. Any of this stuff, my travels, I can't say, yeah, I worked really hard, I made the money to go do that. I didn't. I think I've been put in a position that in certain places it seems enviable, in certain places it doesn't. My brother killed himself and my dad has terminal cancer, and I was molested at 17. So there's pros and cons, but I can truthfully say you don't want to compare, which is also in the New Testament. The grass is not greener. I've been put in a place where I do get these opportunities to really visually show the kingdom of God. Most people aren't going to get that every day. So the realistic thing to do, which is stuff I do when I'm at home and working a job because I don't have any money, because I put a trip to New Zealand on a credit card, you go spend a night in the national forest. Every state in the country has national forests. Every state in the country has state parks that are $15 a night. You go out on a Friday after work, and if you can swing it, you go for 2 nights, buy a $40 camp stove, buy some ground beef, and just disappear for a night or two into the woods. You don't have to go that far. I actually just got an email this morning, a reply to my newsletter from an older couple, and they said, I wish I had it. They said, we don't have the opportunity to travel like you're traveling, but what we do have is we live 15 minutes from the beach. And the gentleman was saying, where I find God and where I find peace is in the early morning hours at the beach. I would love to travel like you do, but I can't. And this is what I do. That is what I hope people take away from what I'm doing. The life I live is not even something I would say you should aspire to. I have no legitimate career path besides what I make. I sell t-shirts and have a book. So it's not the most secure future, but you should absolutely aspire to the principles that, creation is something we've been gifted. And if you feel like your relationship with God is lacking, I would say first, make sure you read the Bible and pray and probably find a church, but also just spend time in creation, whatever that is, outside of a city. Everybody can find a place an hour away from home where you can see the stars. And that's one of the most important things you can do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Thanks for sharing that. And thanks for sharing that email that you got this morning, because I think that's really cool. Because I think sometimes like those people that can find those 15 minutes every day are sometimes better off than maybe me or you on these grand trips, because it's like those are only once or twice a year or, whatever. And so it's
exactly
that everyday appreciation and getting into God's presence every day, even if it's only for 15 minutes.
Exactly. Even if I'm not traveling the majority of the year, another thing social media skews, people think I'm always on the road. I'm in my parents' house, and I have been for months, and I will be for months in the future, taking trips in between. But even still, if I take these grand adventures twice a year for a few months, I still come back the majority of the year. If I don't get into creation and watch a sunset, I'm going to go insane. I'm going to start thinking the world is collapsing and I have no relationship and God doesn't love me. So that is, if you can do it every day, that's great. But I mean, every week, watch the sunrise, watch the sunset, go sleep under the stars,
Yeah.
And I can't really speak to it personally with kids, but I have my friends who do that, take your kid to the beach and go surf with them or something along those lines. There's always excuses. And I'm sure as I mature and, roll into different phases of life, I will come face to face with them. But I hope one thing I never lose is just that desire, that supernatural desire to get outside, because I think there's unlimited benefits scientifically and spiritually that being in creation produces.
Definitely. I could not agree more. So many benefits that I try to encourage people every day to do. Okay, so you've touched on a few different things. So you pick whichever one you want to share about, but would love for you to kind of expand on a valley or a season of wilderness that you experienced and just what God taught you or prepared you for in that season. I know you've touched on a couple different things, so I'm actually not quite sure which direction you're going to go here, but
I don't know either. I mean, as a whole, growing up, I would say I had, I had a pretty normal life, but then one of my sisters was talking to her therapist a little while ago, and the therapist was like, no, you didn't have a normal childhood at all. It was very traumatic. And so looking back, most of my life has been fraught with that, especially in the last 7 years or so, which is a third of my life. I can't believe I'm saying that, but a third of my life, I could go into my dad's cancer or the, other stuff I talked about, but my brother's suicide has got to be the darkest way I've ever gone. It's got to be the darkest road I've ever traveled down. And in that, there's a few things. People have different gifts or blessings in the New Testament that are listed out. And for me, one of those is undoubtedly faith. During that time, I had been going to church, I want to say. I was on the road in Idaho, Montana, around there. But when something like that happens, you're really broken down all the way. I remember being in the car and my mom called me and said, your brother took his life. And all I could do, I just yelled, what? And she said, don't yell at me. And then we hung up, and then you just drive down Interstate 90, heading west, thinking you're going to go to Colorado and fly out of Denver or whatever for 4 hours and literally just yell and cry in the car. Why? I mean, I went through all the stages of grief right there in that ride. In that valley, I think, is where God does his most pivotal work and his best work, undoubtedly. I actually have this scripture, which is Romans 5:3. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And I was also reading in Walden by Henry David Thoreau, which is a fantastic read, something along the lines, which is he was equating this pond to people's souls, which I think is very apt because creation and people are both creations of God. Obviously, one is more magnificent than the other. We are in the image of God, and creation is just a gift. But you see these different valleys and kind of the corresponding depth of a river or something along those lines is the erosion. And you see that in a soul. The events or the history of somebody is equivalent to their depth in a lot of circumstances. So God does his best work spiritually, and to really break down probably the most hipster term I'll use in this podcast, but ego death of sorts, to really kill your ego and show you how much you need God. I don't know if he causes certain events or simply uses them. I think in the world, both are accurate, it'd be fair to say. But you really have to get, I don't just let my dog bark and bite people. You know, you have to train them. And to do that, there's certain things. You give them treats for doing something good, or, you know, you put them in their crate if they're yapping too much. And I think we are dogs in that situation where God will use these events to bring us closer to him and bring us to him and to show us how much we really need him spiritually, physically, and to guide our lives. And there's no better way to do that than through struggle. So in a lot of ways, I mean, I guess it's absolutely a blessing, all the traumatic events I've been through, especially in the past 7 years. But from the outside, I could see how it doesn't look like that. And that's one of the biggest things I try to do with social media is just really convey how important it is. I think Paul talks about it. You shouldn't really long to suffer, but if it has to happen, you should be grateful. I mean, it really is the best thing that's ever happened to me, specifically with my brother.
Thank you for sharing that. And I have no experience that's anywhere similar, so I can't even begin to understand what that process looks like. But as you were talking, it made me think back to what you were saying earlier when you were talking about that moment in going back to a church. Was it starts with that kind of desire or that hunger. And if you don't need something, then you're not always willing to go towards it. And so it's just like you could take it or leave it. You know, it's like dessert at the end of a meal. It's like, I'm not hungry. It is what it, you know, could have it or not. And I think that I'm not saying that death is ever a good thing, but in this situation, it sounds like it gave you that desire and that hunger that God was able to come back in and fulfill in a place where only maybe he could. Yeah.
I mean, death, I've become adequately comfortable with death. I have no desire to get to know it better. I've seen enough, but it is really some of the greatest tools God has is suffering and is tragedy. And I think this is not always the case. I mean, but for me, would I have ever really come to recognize how much I needed God if I had not faced tribulation in the world, or would I have just gone down my path of trying to do everything myself and just been miserable? So I definitely don't think the Lord ordains all suffering. You know, there's children in Africa without water. Is that the fault of God? Obviously, that's not. But in my circumstances, especially where I had a very comfortable life in America with parents who are divorced and a home, there's, you know, some people need to be woken up. And I certainly was.
Yeah. I would love to ask the question, because this obviously isn't the response of most people. And I'm sure that this was not your initial response maybe to this season. But how did the anger, maybe if that was a feeling that you had, how did that push you towards God instead of away from God?
I would say, I'll give you the 3 different examples because there's kind of different circumstances. With my father's pancreatic cancer, there was never, I don't even remember being angry. You know, there's nobody tangible to blame for that. You know, cancer is just cancer. You know, maybe you should have eaten healthier when you were younger, or, you know, not drink alcohol, or whatever the circumstances are for a specific person to get cancer. But it's kind of hard to be angry at cancer cells. So I never really blamed God for that. I honestly, looking back, I couldn't even tell you what I was thinking. That period of my life has just been completely blacked out from my memory. I remember it was not a good time, though. With my brother, like I kind of said, I went through all the stages of grief, 7 stages or whatever they are, in that car ride. And I was never, I don't want to say never. There was definitely some times where I was literally yelling at God, like, why? And I think around that, it was also just yelling at my brother, like, why would you do this to my parents? Obviously, he couldn't hear me at that point, but I don't know if I had to say, I'm trying to think about how that transformed into leaning on God. And I tangibly, I don't think I can point to anything. I mean, to point to something would be like to take credit, like, yeah, I prayed this or I did this. I really think what it comes down to is absolute surrender, and verbally saying that, verbally praying that, like, Lord, I'm surrendering this to you, whatever it is. And not just saying it and then going and trying to control the world, but actually surrendering. I mean, for me, it was so many events back to back to back in my life where I don't even think I had to verbally surrender. I just knew in my heart, this life is too much for me on my own. So I guess some people go, especially somebody like my mother, she went through a period where it was like, God, how could you let this happen? Which I think is very common. I can't speak to that. I never experienced that. It was always, with my brother, or with the situation where I was molested when I was 17, it was always, why did you do that to that person? It was never, God, how could you let that happen? Which I think is, the only place where that's kind of difficult is with cancer, but I never had a question there.
Yeah.
With cancer, you can't blame somebody, You could blame God, but it never occurred to me to.
Yeah. That's interesting. I won't say that makes sense, but that's interesting. And I think that we all have different reactions, and I think we all handle things in different ways. And so that's, just part of why I asked the question, whatever the answer was. Like, I think that people handle things in so many different ways. And a lot of times it's a tragedy happens and you either blame God or you run to God. And, I think that it's always valuable. And I love hearing the stories of whenever people did run to God, because I did the opposite for a long time and ran away from God. And it's like everything that you're looking for is here. But if you're blaming God, then you can't get what you need from God in that process. And so.
Absolutely.
Anyways, just always love hearing how people work through that, because like I said, everybody handles situations a little bit differently, and different perspectives are always very helpful to different people. So. Yeah.
And I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, but was it similar for you, or it was not? I know you said you resisted for a while. What was that like for you?
Yeah, I think for me it was, I'll say when I went through the season of like, how could, God do this? I also didn't really believe in God. And so It was kind of like, well, if there was a sliver of hope that I believed that there was something, it's like, why would they allow this to happen? And so I think in my mind, I had, and I've still battled this as a Christian, even now when I read certain things, understanding how bad things can be good.
Yeah.
And, you look back at the Old Testament and there's like so many times where God's just like destroying villages of people. And you're just like, but how is that a good God? And so I think I've really had to wrestle with what's good and who defines that. And I'm not the judge of that, And there was a really helpful book that I read as a very new believer. It's called Something's Gotta Change by David Platt. And it's about this journey that he goes on, I believe, to the Himalayas. And he sees this part of the world and sees this. I mean, he's been a pastor for like 30 years, and he goes to this area of the country and he sees all these terrible things happen. And he has that moment of like, I know the world in America is bad, but this is like different bad. And like, how can God allow this to happen to these people? And he walks through even him starting to question everything he's built his life on for, 20 or 30 years or however long it's been at that point, and just kind of the thought process through that. And so I'd say that like that was really helpful. And then just like understanding that there's bigger things happening and it's not about me. I'm not the main character. And so, you look at Job and it's like Job was a God-honoring man who had his whole life taken from him, And so I think just like putting things into perspective for me, and going back to, I don't know what's good because I didn't make the plan. And I'm just, there's good things that are going to come from it. and I don't have a clue what those are. And when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to see what those are. But now, like you've said a couple of times, hindsight 2020, I can now look back at the terrible things that have happened in my life and say, wow, God has blessed me. And I wouldn't be where I am today. And I wouldn't have the husband that I have. I wouldn't have the life that I have. I wouldn't have the relationship with God that I have if X, Y, and Z didn't happen in my life. And that doesn't make those things good in and of themselves. They were terrible things some of the things I was a victim to, some things I was responsible for. And so, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, on their own, not good things, but God uses all things for his glory. Mm-hmm. I mean, even people who resist them to his death, he still uses that for his glory, which is a very humbling thing to try and comprehend, and something that I don't think we were created to comprehend. I mean, that's part of the mystery of God, is how do you even want to know? Do I even want to know how God uses these bad things for his good? Yeah. I mean, it would probably blow my mind. I'm best off, again, this just comes back, I guess, to having a gift of faith, but I'm perfectly satisfied just knowing that God is taking care of certain things, and whatever happens in my life, if I honor him and pursue him and live out his will to the best of my understanding, then throughout all of time, his will be done. Yep. That's a very difficult place to come to understanding. And some people never come to that. Some people just blame God their whole life, the God they don't even believe in their whole life. Yeah. But I don't know why I got there. I mean, that's not really true. I feel like I was brought to that place supernaturally by the Holy Spirit. Obviously, how is a 20-year-old supposed to comprehend, or supposed to not comprehend, but come to the understanding that you're not supposed to understand why these bad things that have happened to you? And for me personally, I feel like I know enough to say that I've been brought through these terrible things to this, dare I say, beautiful place now to give testimony to the glory of God and to spread the word and to bring my experiences and what I've learned and my relationship with God to other people my age in similar situations that I used to be in. Yeah.
Yeah. So for somebody who maybe is going through similar situations, they're a young adult, life seems to be kind of crumbling around. They're not really understanding what's going on or even where to turn. What advice would you give to somebody maybe in that season of life?
That's a good question. And I'll preface it by saying so much of what people tell you when you're in those places is meaningless. It means nothing to you. The only thing that matters would literally be God picking you up and sending you to heaven where your pain is gone. Unfortunately, that only happens to a few people. Not the majority of us aren't that lucky, but specifically, I would go through the book of Jeremiah. I would read through that in its entirety. Jeremiah was a prophet, a young prophet, about, I think, under 20. And God put these things on his heart, and he really was not stoked about it, I think, to say. He really wrestled with it and why these terrible things had happened to him, even though that was somehow supposed to be in God's will. Why me? The book of Jeremiah is a fantastic place to go. But what I would say personally is that, for what it's worth, because if somebody told me things, I wouldn't have listened to them when I was in the midst of it. But it's kind of cliche because it's true. God does use all things for his glory. And maybe it's more powerful if it comes from somebody who's been through more than me. But if you're in those circumstances that I've been through, I mean, on the other side, it's so clear to me. Yeah, I wasn't stoked to go through it, and it sucked. It really, having your dad get terminal cancer was 6 months, and then your brother kills himself after being molested. That's not the life I envisioned. But God did use those things for his glory, and he didn't ask that much of me. All he asked of me was that I surrender it to him and be a good steward of that which he gave me, which was the little bit of money I had from working a job and the community at a church that I just wandered into. So I would say you have to trust those feelings in your heart. You have to pray to God for strength. He will grant it to you. The Holy Spirit will guide you. Ask for guidance, not wisdom, because when you ask for wisdom, that's when, wisdom is something you want to be careful asking for. But
there's responsibility there.
There's a lot. I did ask for wisdom when I was younger, and I probably wish I did. But just rely on God. I would specifically say get into the book of Jeremiah, which I think is overlooked, and pray for strength.
Yeah.
And then take advantage of that which God has given you. If that's a local church, a community, I think that is absolutely essential. Specifically, I remember one time in the middle of a service, the church I used to go to, they would have people in the back who would pray for you. And it was the anniversary or right around the 1 year of my brother's suicide. And I went back and just broke down, asked for prayer from a guy who I knew. And it's those little nuggets that God will give you to sustain yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good that you shared. Use the things that you have, whether that is a church or someone that is willing to just pray for you, or, whatever that looks like for you. I think that that's really important, because I think so often we're just even scared to reach out a hand and say we need help.
Yeah. And it's not like, I use that example, but it's not like a church was just given to me. I still had to go hunt it down. God gave me the strength to do it. God gave me the opportunities, but I had to go do the labor. God can't labor for you.
Yep. That's a really good thing to leave us on, is God's going to put it on our heart. God's going to give us the resources, but we have to be the one to take the steps. And we have to be willing to move forward. I feel like God calls us up and forward in a lot of ways. And so, I think that's a really good thing to leave us on. So again, I've said this a couple of times, but thank you just so much for sharing all the different things that you've shared. I feel like you've left us with so many good things, and you've been vulnerable in many different ways. And so I just thank you so much for that, especially as a young adult, especially a man. I think that it's really important and really valuable to be vulnerable and to share and to, just share also what the Lord has done and the ways in which he's brought you through things. I think there's a lot of power in that. So just want to thank you and honor you for doing that, and would love for you to share with the listeners just where they can find you or what you got going on social media and all the things.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. First of all, I've done a few podcasts. I've never teared up on one. So that's a first, but brycetravels.com. Put your email in. That's where my newsletter goes out. I try to do it pretty consistently every few days. Always insights or whatever I'm learning from Lord or whatever adventures I'm on. And I'll send you my free road trip guide in exchange. That seems like a pretty fair trade. Social media, I'm on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook at Bryce C. Travels. And maybe YouTube Sunday if I upload vlogs. We'll see. But for right now, I do have my book at brycetravels.com on the shop, which is the search, stories, and photographs from spending my college years on the road, which I would say is a fantastic coffee table book. And you can buy that on my site. Yeah.
And you also have apparel, right?
I do have apparel. Yep. The Out There brand, which I'm wearing right now, which the whole goal is, we're talking and we've expressed ourselves and communicated, but the majority of people you interact with, you actually never talk to. So the goal with the Out There brand is to inspire people or convey a message that you don't have to do verbally, because most of the time you're not going to have a hour-long conversation with somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you all go check it out and follow him on all the things: Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Go subscribe to the newsletter. And just thank you so much again for being here, Bryce.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Kenzie.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of My Valley, His Victory. If you or someone you know are interested in being on this podcast, please email myvalleyhisvictory@gmail.com.